The Mothman's warning. The first sightings. The reports started small, a trucker claiming to see a giant, winged figure swooping across the highway, a hiker finding massive, claw-like footprints near the mountain trails. In the small town of Coldwater Hollow, people dismissed the sightings as drunken ramblings or overactive imaginations. That was until Sarah Bennett, a young journalist for the Coldwater Gazette, received a frantic call from her editor one evening. "Another sighting," he said. "Out by the old bridge. I need you on it." Sarah rolled her eyes but grabbed her recorder. As she drove to the bridge, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping over her. When she arrived, the witness, a pale, trembling teenager, pointed to the sky. "It was huge," he stammered. "Red eyes. Wings. It just stared at me." Sarah scanned the area, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. A low hum filled the air, and for a split second, she thought she saw a shadowy figure perched on the bridge, its glowing red eyes fixed on her. Then it vanished. The first disaster. The following morning, the bridge collapsed. A school bus crossing it barely escaped, its passengers shaken but unharmed. The town buzzed with rumors. "The Mothman," some whispered. "It's a warning." Sarah, skeptical but intrigued, dug deeper. She interviewed locals who claimed to have seen the creature over the years. Each sighting seemed to precede a disaster, a factory explosion, a mine collapse, a wildfire. But as she pieced the timeline together, she noticed something chilling. The disasters weren't random. They were escalating. The stranger's warning. One night, as Sarah pored over her notes in the Gazette's office, an elderly man entered. His name was Harold Greaves, a retired miner with a reputation for spinning wild tales. "You're looking into the Mothman," he said, his voice a rasp. Sarah nodded. "You've seen it." "Seen it? I've heard it," Harold replied. "A screech like nails on glass. And when you see those eyes, you know something bad's coming." Sarah leaned forward. "But why? Why does it appear before disasters?" Harold hesitated. "The Mothman doesn't just warn about disasters. It's connected to them. It's no angel. It's a harbinger of chaos, and maybe, just maybe, the cause. A dark connection." Sarah dug into Coldwater's history. She found an old legend about a cursed mountain spirit said to bring ruin to anyone who disturbed its domain. She also uncovered reports of strange experiments conducted in the area during the Cold War, classified projects involving radiation and genetic manipulation. One name kept appearing in her research: Dr. Marcus Bell, a disgraced scientist who vanished decades ago. Sarah tracked down Bell's former assistant, now an ailing man in a nearby nursing home. "The Mothman," he whispered, clutching her arm. "It wasn't supposed to exist. We created it. Spliced genes, twisted nature. But it got out into the mountains. And now it feeds." "Feeds on what?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. "Fear," he said. "It thrives on the chaos it creates." The second disaster. 2 days later, an explosion rocked the town. A gas leak ignited in the old theater during a packed event, injuring dozens. Survivors claimed to have seen a winged figure circling the building just before the blast. Sarah, shaken but determined, reviewed security footage from nearby businesses. There it was, the Mothman, its glowing eyes cutting through the grainy film. She realized the creature wasn't just warning the town, it was orchestrating the disasters, amplifying fear and despair. The final clue. Sarah discovered an abandoned lab deep in the mountains, its coordinates scribbled in the assistant's old journal. With Harold's reluctant help, she trekked to the site. The lab was a decaying ruin, its walls marked with faded warning signs. Inside, Sarah found records of Project Chimera, detailing experiments on creating a bioengineered guardian for the town's industrial sites. But something had gone horribly wrong. A journal entry from Dr. Bell confirmed her fears. "Subject has escaped containment. Displays hyperintelligence and an ability to manipulate electromagnetic fields. Appears drawn to human distress. Termination attempts unsuccessful." As Sarah read, a familiar hum filled the air. Harold gripped her shoulder. "It's here," he whispered. "The confrontation." The Mothman loomed in the doorway, its massive wings casting long shadows across the room. Its red eyes burned like embers, locking onto Sarah. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The creature didn't respond, but a wave of fear washed over her, overwhelming and suffocating. Sarah clutched her head, fighting to stay conscious. Harold pulled out a flare gun and fired. The Mothman screeched, the sound shattering the lab's windows. It retreated into the night, but its presence lingered. "We need to leave," Harold said, dragging her to her feet. "You can't stop it. No one can. The town's fate." Back in Coldwater Hollow, Sarah tried to warn the townspeople. She published her findings, but most dismissed her as a conspiracy theorist. Then came the final disaster, a landslide that buried half the town. Dozens were killed, and the survivors reported seeing the Mothman circling the mountains in the hours leading up to it. The truth buried. Coldwater Hollow became a ghost town, its survivors scattering, its tragedies forgotten by the outside world. Sarah moved away, haunted by what she had uncovered. But late at night, she often found herself staring out her window, searching the skies for glowing red eyes. She knew the Mothman wasn't finished. And somewhere, in another unsuspecting town, it was waiting for its next warning, and its next feast of fear. The Skinwalker's domain. The warnings. The drive into the remote desert forest was uneventful, though the warnings they'd heard lingered in the back of their minds. "Locals love their ghost stories," Josh said, rolling his eyes. MIA, the trip organizer, glanced at him from the passenger seat. "Still, maybe we should avoid the area they warned about." "You heard the Clark. Stay away from the lights." "Superstitions," Kelly chimed in from the back seat, scrolling through her phone. "We'll be fine." As the group of 5 reached the trailhead, an older man approached. He wore a battered hat and carried a walking stick. "You're heading to the wrong place," he said gravely, pointing toward the woods. "That's no land for hikers. Turn back." Josh smirked. "Thanks, but we're good." The man gripped Josh's arm tightly. "If you see lights or hear voices in the woods, run. And never, ever answer a call you don't recognize." Entering the woods. The trail was breathtaking, towering pines, rocky cliffs, and wildflowers in full bloom. The group was confident, joking about the warnings as they set up camp near a clearing. That night, the air turned cold, and the forest grew unnaturally quiet. "I don't hear any crickets," MIA whispered, pulling her sleeping bag tighter. "Relax," Josh said, tossing another log onto the fire. Just then, a faint light flickered in the trees. "Maybe someone else is camping nearby," Kelly suggested, though her voice wavered. MIA frowned. "There's no one else out here. I checked the register." The light moved closer, bobbing like a lantern carried by unseen hands. "Let's check it out," Josh said, grabbing a flashlight. "Bad idea," MIA hissed, but Josh and Kelly were already heading into the woods. The first disappearance. Josh and Kelly didn't return. MIA and the remaining 2, Ethan and Sarah, called out, their voices trembling as the hours dragged on. "What if they're hurt?" Sarah whispered, clutching her jacket. Ethan shook his head. "We should stay put. If we split up." A voice echoed through the trees, soft but unmistakable. "Help." It was Kelly. May froze. "Where is she?" "Over here." The voice came again, but something was off. It was hollow, too perfect, as though it were coming from a recording. Ethan shined his flashlight toward the sound, and another light appeared, impossibly close now. "Kelly," he called. The voice repeated, "Help." The shape in the shadows. Ethan stepped toward the light, but MIA grabbed his arm. "Stop," she said. "That's not her." The flashlight beam caught something between the trees, a tall figure hunched unnaturally, its limbs too long, its skin stretched tight over its bones. The figure turned, and MIA stifled a scream. It looked like Kelly, her face, her hair, but its eyes were black voids, and its movements were jerky, wrong. "Help," it said again, in Kelly's voice. Ethan stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The creature lunged, but by the time they scrambled to pick up the beam, it was gone. The true danger. The trio abandoned the campsite, running deeper into the forest. The lights followed, darting through the trees like will-o'-the-wisps. "Keep moving," MIA shouted. "Where are we even going?" Ethan panted. The answer came in the form of a guttural snarl that echoed from all directions. Shapes moved in the darkness, shifting, twisting forms that mimicked animals, but with an unnatural gait. One stepped into view, a creature with the body of a wolf and the face of Josh. "Josh," Sarah stammered. The creature smiled, a chilling, human expression on a bestial face. "MIA," it said, perfectly imitating Josh's voice. "The sacred ground." Desperate, they stumbled into a clearing ringed with ancient carvings etched into the stones. The symbols pulsed faintly, and the air felt heavier, almost oppressive. "This must be the sacred area the locals warned about," MIA whispered. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. The creatures circled the clearing, their forms flickering and shifting, one moment animals, the next grotesque hybrids of their missing friends. MIA noticed an old altar in the center, covered in ashen bones. "Maybe we can use this. It feels important." As the skinwalkers closed in, MIA grabbed a stone knife from the altar. She didn't know how she knew, but instinct told her what needed to be done. "Hold them off," she yelled, cutting her palm and letting her blood drip onto the altar. A price paid. The carvings glowed brighter, and the forest shook with an unearthly roar. The skinwalkers stopped, their forms twisting violently as if in pain. The altar's light expanded, forcing the creatures back into the shadows. Ethan and Sarah watched in stunned silence as the forest grew quiet again. "It worked," Sarah breathed. But MIA swayed, her face pale. "The altar, it takes a price." Before they could react, the light consumed MIA, pulling her into the altar as the carvings faded to black. The survivors. Ethan and Sarah stumbled out of the forest at dawn, exhausted and haunted. The locals didn't ask questions when they returned, their hollow eyes suggesting they already knew. "What happened to your friend?" the old man asked. Sarah looked back at the forest. "She saved us." The man nodded gravely. "She won't be the last." Back in the woods, the lights began to flicker once more, and the echoes of voices, familiar and false, carried through the trees. The Banshee's Forest. The wails of the grove. The stories of the Banshee's Forest had always intrigued David. He was a man of science, a rational thinker, and he couldn't stomach the villagers' superstitions. "She's just a myth," he said confidently over his pint at the local pub. "A figment of frightened imaginations." The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. "People who hear the Banshee's wail don't just die," said an old man named Fergus. "They vanish. Body, soul, everything gone." David smirked. "Then I suppose I'll have to investigate and report back. Maybe your Banshee needs a skeptic to set her straight." "You won't come back," Fergus muttered under his breath as David left the pub. Into the grove. The grove was hauntingly beautiful. Moonlight filtered through gnarled branches, casting skeletal shadows on the forest floor. A chilling wind whispered through the leaves, carrying with it faint, mournful cries. David paused. The sound was eerie, but it could easily be explained. A fox's call, perhaps, or the wind catching in the trees. As he ventured deeper, the cries grew louder, more distinct. They weren't animalistic, but unmistakably human, piercing wails filled with sorrow. "Just the wind," he muttered, though his grip tightened on his flashlight. Suddenly, the cries stopped. The silence was suffocating, pressing in from all sides. "Hello," he called, his voice cracking slightly. From the shadows ahead, a figure stepped forward, a woman, draped in tattered, translucent robes that billowed unnaturally despite the still air. Her face was obscured by a tangled veil of hair, but her hollow eyes glinted like shards of ice in the moonlight. "The Banshee appears." David froze. Logic fled as primal fear gripped him. "Who are you?" he managed to whisper. The figure raised a bony hand, pointing directly at him. Her wails began again, louder and closer, resonating in his chest like a death knell. "You're not real," he said, stepping back. But the ground beneath him seemed to shift, the roots of the trees twisting like skeletal fingers. His flashlight flickered and died. The Banshee's voice turned to words, each syllable echoing with otherworldly malice. "Leave, or join the others." The truth beneath the grove. David stumbled backward but tripped on something hard. Looking down, he saw a crumbling gravestone partially buried in the dirt. Its inscription was illegible, but it was surrounded by others, an entire graveyard hidden within the grove. "Who are you?" he asked again, louder this time. The banshee's figure shimmered, and her face became clearer. Her features were gaunt and sorrowful, but her eyes burned with fury. "I am their warning," she hissed. "I am their fate." The gravestones began to glow faintly, and translucent figures emerged, their faces twisted in agony. David recognized some of them, missing villagers whose names had become legends of caution. "You didn't warn them," David whispered, realization dawning. "You lured them." The banshee smiled, a cold, terrible smile. The trap closes. The forest seemed to close in, the trees leaning forward as if to block his escape. The wails grew louder, overlapping until they were a cacophony that drowned out his thoughts. David tried to run, but the ground beneath him shifted again, and he sank into the dirt as if it were quicksand. The banshee floated closer, her skeletal hands outstretched. "You sought the truth," she said. "Now you will join it." "No," David shouted, clawing at the dirt. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his pocket knife. With a desperate swing, he cut at the roots snaking around his legs. The banshee screeched, her form flickering as if disrupted. David scrambled to his feet and bolted toward the edge of the grove. The haunting escape. The banshee's wails pursued him, louder and more disorienting with every step. The gravestones glowed brighter, and ghostly hands reached out from the ground, clawing at his legs. The edge of the grove came into sight, marked by the comforting glow of his car's headlights. With one final burst of adrenaline, David leaped through the tree line. The banshee's scream reached a deafening pitch, and then, silence. He turned back, gasping for breath. The grove was still and dark, as if nothing had happened. But as he climbed into his car, he noticed something in the rearview mirror, a faint, glowing figure standing at the tree line, watching him. The warning endures. David returned to the village, disheveled and shaken. "You saw her, didn't you?" Fergus asked. David nodded. "She's not a warning. She's death." The villagers exchanged knowing glances. "And you're lucky to have escaped," Fergus said. David didn't feel lucky. He still heard the wails in his dreams, and every time he passed a mirror, he caught a glimpse of the banshee's shadow lingering behind him. He knew she wasn't done with him yet. The Chupacabra's woods. Bloodless shadows. In the quiet farming community of Arroyo Hills, panic spread like wildfire. Each morning brought fresh horrors. Livestock found lifeless, their throats punctured and their bodies drained of blood. No tracks, no signs of struggle, just the eerie, silent work of a predator no one could explain. Miguel Alvarez had lost 3 goats in as many nights. His son, Diego, only 15 but eager to prove himself, urged action. "We can't wait for it to take the rest," Diego said, gripping the handle of his hunting knife. "We need to stop it, whatever it is." Miguel frowned. The forest bordering their land was vast, its shadows deep and forbidding. "We'll set traps first," he said. "If it's an animal, we'll catch it." But deep down, Miguel feared they were dealing with something no trap could hold. The forest beckons. That night, under a waning moon, Miguel and Diego set snares and bait around the perimeter of their farm. As the hours dragged on, an unsettling silence descended. Even the crickets seemed to hold their breath. Around midnight, a guttural growl echoed from the edge of the woods. Miguel grabbed his rifle, motioning for Diego to stay close. They moved cautiously toward the sound, their lantern casting flickering light on the tangled undergrowth. Then they saw it, a shadow darting between the trees, low to the ground, too quick for Miguel to aim. "It's in the woods," Diego whispered, his voice trembling with excitement and fear. Miguel hesitated. "Stay here," he ordered. But Diego didn't listen. The first encounter. Diego followed the movement into the forest, the lantern barely illuminating the path ahead. He could feel Miguel's frustrated glare boring into his back, but the thrill of the hunt propelled him forward. The growl came again, closer this time. Diego froze, his heart pounding. A pair of glowing red eyes stared back at him from the shadows. "Papa," he shouted, just as the creature lunged. Miguel fired his rifle, the shot deafening in the stillness. The creature screeched and vanished into the darkness, leaving only a smear of blood on the ground. Miguel grabbed Diego's arm, pulling him back. "What were you thinking?" he scolded. "It was huge," Diego said, his voice shaking. "Not a coyote. Not a wolf. Something else." Miguel stared into the woods, his grip tightening on the rifle. "We need to leave. Now." The hunt deepens. Back at the farm, they inspected the blood trail leading into the woods. Miguel was torn. He wanted to protect his son, but leaving the creature alive meant more attacks, more losses. "We finish this tonight," Miguel decided, loading his rifle. Together, Diego insisted, and Miguel reluctantly agreed. They ventured deeper into the forest, following the faint trail of blood. The trees grew denser, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. Strange marks appeared on the trunks, scratches too deep and deliberate to be from any natural animal. A sickly sweet odor filled the air, and Miguel knew they were close. The predator revealed. The trail led to a clearing, where a makeshift den of bones and torn hides lay scattered. In the center, the chupacabra stood, its wiry, spiked body illuminated by the moonlight. Its skin was mottled and hairless, its fangs glinting as it snarled. But what struck Miguel most was its eyes, not just red, but intelligent, calculating. "It's watching us," Miguel whispered. Before they could react, the creature leaped toward them with unnatural speed. Miguel fired, but the chupacabra dodged effortlessly, its screech echoing through the forest. Diego swung his lantern, the firelight startling the creature and buying them a moment to regroup. "It's not just an animal," Miguel realized aloud. "It's hunting us. The trap is set." Knowing they couldn't outrun it, Miguel quickly formulated a plan. He instructed Diego to climb a nearby tree while he lured the chupacabra into a trap. "Papa, no. It'll kill you." Diego protested. "Just do as I say." Miguel barked, his tone leaving no room for argument. Miguel ran toward the den, shouting and firing into the air. The chupacabra followed, its movements almost playful, as if it enjoyed the chase. Reaching the tree line, Miguel turned and aimed at a snare he had hastily set, a noose of thick rope tied to a bent sapling. As the creature lunged, Miguel fired at the rope, releasing the tension and snapping the trap shut around its leg. The chupacabra howled in rage, thrashing against the restraint. The cost of victory. Diego climbed down, holding his knife tightly. "What now?" he asked, his voice shaking. "We end this," Miguel said grimly, raising his rifle. But as he aimed, the creature's cries changed, becoming almost human. It stared at Miguel with pleading eyes, its intelligence unmistakable. Miguel hesitated, the weight of his decision heavy. Was this a predator or something more, a being caught between worlds, acting on instinct? "Papa, do it," Diego urged. Miguel pulled the trigger. The forest fell silent. As the creature lay still, its body seemed to wither, turning to ash that scattered in the wind. The forest felt lighter, as if a curse had been lifted. The legacy of the hunt. Back at the farm, Miguel and Diego worked in silence, reinforcing the fences and tending to the surviving livestock. "Do you think it's over?" Diego asked. Miguel didn't answer immediately. He looked toward the forest, where the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. "For now," he said. But deep down, he knew the chupacabra wasn't just a creature. It was a warning, a reminder that some things in the wild should never be disturbed. And the forest, dark and ancient, still held secrets they would never fully understand. The Jersey Devil's return. Echoes of the legend. The Pine Barrens had always carried an air of mystery, a dense, sprawling wilderness steeped in legend. Tales of the Jersey Devil had faded over the years, relegated to campfire stories and local folklore. But when a group of thrill-seekers vanished without a trace, the whispers began again. Park Ranger Sarah Ellis, a seasoned protector of the Barrens, was the first to respond to the search call. She knew the terrain well, but something about this case unsettled her. The missing group had left behind no clues, no campsite, no tracks. Just silence. Her unease deepened when she found claw marks gouged into the trunks of trees near the group's last known location. They were too deep for any animal she'd encountered and spaced too far apart to be human. The first encounter. 2 nights into the search, Sarah camped alone near the Cedar Bridge Trail, a spot infamous in local lore. The forest was unnaturally still, the usual hum of nocturnal life replaced by an oppressive quiet. Around midnight, a chilling cry pierced the silence, half scream, half roar. Sarah shot up, her flashlight cutting through the dark. She reached for her rifle, heart pounding as the cry echoed again, closer this time. A branch snapped behind her, and she spun around. 2 glowing red eyes stared at her from the trees, followed by the rustle of massive wings. Before she could react, the creature vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only a sense of foreboding. Clues in the ash. The following morning, Sarah found more signs, a trail of scorched ground leading deeper into the barrens, the air still carrying the faint scent of sulfur. She radioed her supervisor, but the response was dismissive. "Probably just some wild dogs," her boss said. "Finish the sweep and report back." But Sarah knew better. The claw marks, the cries, the sulfuric air, it matched the old stories too perfectly. Determined to uncover the truth, she continued alone, following the burned trail. The Devil's Lair. The trail led Sarah to an overgrown clearing where the trees seemed to bend unnaturally inward, forming a canopy that blocked out the sun. In the center was a dilapidated shack, its roof caved in and walls covered in strange symbols. Inside, she found remnants of a ritual, animal bones arranged in spirals, melted candles, and what appeared to be fresh blood smeared across the floor. A low growl rumbled behind her, and Sarah turned to see the creature in full. The Jersey Devil was as horrifying as the legends described: cloven hooves, leathery bat-like wings, and a goat-like face twisted in rage. It towered over her, its eyes blazing with fury. The chase. Sarah ran, the creature's wings beating thunderously behind her. She zigzagged through the trees, her flashlight flickering as she stumbled over roots and rocks. A gust of wind knocked her off her feet, and she rolled into a shallow ravine. She pressed herself against the earth, barely daring to breathe as the Jersey Devil landed above her. It sniffed the air, its guttural growls vibrating through the ground. Suddenly, a distant shout distracted the beast. Search and rescue teams were combing the area, their voices carrying through the trees. The creature let out an ear-splitting roar and took to the skies, disappearing into the canopy. The warning. Sarah regrouped with the search team, her clothes torn and her face pale. "You look like you've seen a ghost," one of her colleagues joked. "It wasn't a ghost," Sarah muttered. She led them to the clearing, but the shack was gone, replaced by a circle of scorched earth. The symbols, the bones, everything had vanished. The team dismissed her story as stress-induced, chalking up the disappearances to a tragic accident. But Sarah knew what she had seen. The devil lives. Over the next few weeks, more disappearances were reported, each case eerily similar. Locals began avoiding the woods entirely, their whispers growing louder. One night, as Sarah reviewed her notes, she found a map of the barrens with the location of the burned clearing marked. She traced the symbols she had seen in the shack, her hands trembling. The pattern was unmistakable, a summoning ritual. Someone, or something, had brought the Jersey Devil back. Determined to stop the creature, Sarah prepared for a final confrontation. She armed herself with flares, traps, and her rifle, knowing the battle would be unlike anything she'd faced before. The final stand. Under the light of a full moon, Sarah returned to the barrens. The forest felt alive with malevolence, each shadow hiding potential danger. At the heart of the woods, she found the devil waiting. It roared, charging at her with unnatural speed. Sarah lit a flare, hurling it at the creature. The bright light disoriented it, giving her a brief window to set her trap, a net reinforced with steel cables. The devil lunged again, and the trap snapped shut around it. It howled in rage, thrashing against its bonds as Sarah aimed her rifle. "Go back to hell," she muttered, firing a round into its chest. The creature let out a final, ear-piercing scream before dissolving into ash, leaving only a faint smell of sulfur behind. The aftermath. The disappearances stopped, and the forest returned to its uneasy quiet. But Sarah knew the Pine Barrens would never truly be safe. The Jersey Devil was part of the land, its presence woven into the very fabric of the woods. As she left the forest for the last time, she glanced back at the shadows. The Barrens had claimed many lives, and she knew it wasn't finished yet. The Spiderwood Massacre. Into the web. Spiderwood Forest had a sinister reputation. Its once thriving community had vanished decades ago after a string of disappearances, leaving behind stories of strange webs and unnatural creatures lurking among the trees. Locals avoided the area, dismissing it as cursed. When a team of biologists led by Dr. Elise Hart ventured into Spiderwood to investigate its web-covered trees, they believed the stories were nothing more than folklore. The webs, they theorized, could belong to an undiscovered species of spider. For science, it was worth the risk. The group, Elise, her assistant Jake, photographer MIA, and guide Trevor, entered the forest on a cool autumn morning. The first thing they noticed was the silence. No birds, no insects, only the sound of their boots crunching fallen leaves. The first signs. As they delved deeper, the webs became more intricate and dense, stretching across trees like ghostly curtains. MIA paused to photograph the peculiar patterns. "These are huge," she whispered, her voice barely carrying in the oppressive quiet. Trevor frowned. "Too big for any spider I know." Jake pointed out strands that shimmered unnaturally in the sunlight. "Is it moving?" he asked. The group froze as the web trembled, as if something enormous was shifting in the distance. The first victim. That night, they set up camp in a clearing. The team was on edge, but Elise reassured them. "We're here to observe. Stay calm, and don't wander off." Jake, unable to shake the eerie feeling, volunteered for the first watch. Hours passed uneventfully until he heard faint rustling beyond the firelight. Gripping his flashlight, he stepped toward the sound. A shadow moved, fast and low. Before Jake could react, something yanked him off his feet. His scream was cut short, leaving only the snapping of branches and the echo of his flashlight hitting the ground. The hunt begins. The others woke to find Jake missing and the campsite in disarray. Strands of sticky webbing clung to nearby trees, leading deeper into the forest. "We have to leave," Trevor said, his face pale. "No," Elise insisted. "Jake could still be alive. We can't abandon him." Reluctantly, they followed the trail, each step taking them further into Spiderwood's heart. The webs became thicker, some glistening with what looked like blood. The lair. They found Jake hanging in a cocoon high in the trees, his face frozen in terror. MIA stifled a scream, but the sound carried through the forest, drawing attention. A low clicking noise echoed around them, followed by the skittering of legs. Out of the shadows emerged the creature, a massive spider-like beast with glistening black eyes and sharp, jagged limbs. Its abdomen pulsed as it moved, its sheer size dwarfing the tallest tree. The group ran, but the creature was faster. It snatched MIA with a sickening crunch, dragging her into the shadows as her screams faded. 6 desperate measures. Elise and Trevor stumbled into a dense thicket, their breaths ragged. Trevor pulled out a flare gun. "We're not making it out unless we kill that thing." Elise nodded, her mind racing. "It's intelligent. It's herding us. We need to set a trap." They used the flare gun to ignite a patch of webbing, creating a barrier of flames. The creature screeched, momentarily retreating, giving them time to prepare. 7 the final stand. The pair lured the creature to an open area where they had rigged a makeshift trap using fallen logs and a jagged ravine. As the beast charged, Trevor fired the last flare, striking its abdomen and setting it ablaze. With a guttural roar, the creature lunged, but the weakened ground gave way, and it tumbled into the ravine. Flames licked at its body as it writhed, its screeches echoing through the forest. The escape. Elise and Trevor emerged from Spiderwood hours later, battered and blooded. Authorities dismissed their story as hysteria, blaming the deaths on a pack of wolves. But Elise knew the truth. As she left the area, she glanced back at the forest and saw something glinting among the trees, fresh webs being spun. Spiderwood wasn't finished. The night of the howling moon. A family getaway. The Harper family, Parents James and Linda, along with their teenage children Mary and Jake, had planned this camping trip for weeks. They wanted to escape the noise of the city and reconnect in the serenity of the forest. The first day passed uneventfully. They set up camp near a tranquil lake, roasted marshmallows under the stars, and shared stories around the campfire. But as the moon rose higher in the sky, Mary noticed something unsettling. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. The others fell silent, and then they heard it, a low, mournful howl that seemed to echo from every direction. "Just wolves," James said, though his voice lacked confidence. The first encounter. The howling continued into the night, growing closer with each passing hour. Around midnight, a branch snapped just beyond the tree line. James grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the noise. Two glowing yellow eyes stared back. Before anyone could react, the creature vanished into the darkness. "What was that?" Linda asked, her voice shaking. "Probably just an animal," James said, though his hands trembled. But deep down, he knew no ordinary animal had eyes like that, or moved that quickly. A warning ignored. The next morning, the family decided to hike deeper into the forest, hoping to distract themselves from the unsettling events of the night. As they ventured along a narrow trail, they stumbled upon an old, rusted sign nailed to a tree. "Beware the howling moon. Do not stay past nightfall." "What does that mean?" Mary asked, snapping a picture of the sign. "Local superstition," James said, brushing it off. "Come on, let's keep moving." But the forest seemed different now, darker, quieter. The air felt heavy as if the woods themselves were watching. The transformation. That evening, as the family prepared for another night in the forest, Jake complained of a fever. His skin was pale, and his hands trembled. "Must have caught something," Linda said, dabbing his forehead with a damp cloth. But as the moon began to rise, Jake's condition worsened. He thrashed in his sleeping bag, his eyes rolling back in his head. Then came the howling, closer this time, almost at the edge of the camp. Jake's body convulsed, and his skin began to ripple unnaturally. His breathing grew ragged, his nails elongating into claws. "Get back!" James shouted, pulling Mary and Linda away. Jake let out an ear-piercing scream as his body transformed. His limbs elongated, fur sprouted from his skin, and his face twisted into a monstrous snout. The hunt begins. Before the family could react, Jake, no longer fully human, bolted into the woods, his glowing eyes disappearing into the shadows. "What's happening to him?" Linda cried. One of them now," James said grimly, gripping the hatchet he'd brought for firewood. The howls resumed, this time answered by others. The pack was closing in. The family huddled together, desperate to figure out their next move. "We can't just leave him," MIA said. "He's not Jake anymore," James said, his voice breaking. "If we don't get out of here now, we're all dead." The pack emerges. As they debated, the first werewolf appeared, stepping into the light of the campfire. It was massive, its muscles rippling beneath its dark fur, saliva dripping from its jagged teeth. More shapes emerged from the shadows, 3, 4, 5 of them, their glowing eyes fixed on the family. "Run!" James shouted. They bolted into the forest, the werewolves chasing close behind. Their snarls and heavy footsteps echoed through the trees, growing louder with each passing second. The final stand. The family reached a rocky clearing, where James turned to face the pack. "Go!" he shouted at Linda and Mary, brandishing his hatchet. "No, we can't leave you," Linda cried. "Go!" he repeated, charging at the first werewolf with a desperate roar. Linda and Mary ran, tears streaming down their faces as James's screams echoed behind them. They didn't stop until they reached an old, crumbling cabin. Locking the door behind them, they collapsed in exhaustion. The truth revealed. Inside the cabin, they found an old journal on a dusty table. The entries told of a curse placed on the forest centuries ago, turning those who wandered too far into beasts under the full moon. One passage caught Mary's eye: the infected can only be cured before their first full transformation. After that, they belong to the pack forever. Before they could process the information, the door splintered. Jake, fully transformed, burst into the cabin, his claws slashing wildly. "Jake, stop!" Mary screamed, holding up the journal. For a brief moment, his glowing eyes flickered with recognition. But it was too late. The rest of the pack had arrived. Escape, or not. Linda grabbed a rusty knife from the table and thrust it into the nearest werewolf, but the others swarmed her. Mary bolted out the back, the journal clutched tightly in her hands. She ran until her lungs burned, the howls echoing behind her. When she finally reached the edge of the forest, the howling stopped. Turning back, she saw nothing but darkness. The survivor. Days later, Mary returned to the forest with authorities, but they found no trace of her family, or the werewolves. She kept the journal, vowing to uncover a way to end the curse. But every full moon, she hears the howls in her dreams, a chilling reminder that the pack is still out there, and her brother is one of them. The shadow of Bigfoot. Into the wild. The team had spent years chasing legends, but this time, they were determined to make history. Led by seasoned filmmaker Eric Vaughn, the group included tech-savvy camerawoman Sophie, skeptic and biologist Dr. Natalie Carter, and local tracker Ben Harrison, who claimed to have seen the creature years ago. The Pacific Northwest forest stretched endlessly before them, a sea of green and shadow. "This is the prime location," Eric said, excitement crackling in his voice. "We'll prove Bigfoot is real." Ben stopped at the edge of the trail, his expression darkening. "You prove it, but don't provoke it. Some things are better left alone." The others laughed nervously, but Sophie noticed the way Ben's hand lingered near the hunting knife on his belt. Signs of something. Hours into their trek, the team found their first signs: massive footprints pressed deep into the soil, claw marks high on the trunks of ancient trees, and strange, guttural sounds echoing through the forest. "Could be a bear," Natalie said, though she sounded unsure. "No bear walks like this," Ben muttered, pointing to the long stride between the prints. "And those calls? They're warnings." They set up camp as the sun dipped below the horizon. Sophie set up cameras around the perimeter, the infrared lenses ready to capture any nocturnal activity. The first encounter. That night, as the campfire crackled, the forest came alive with strange noises, branches snapping, distant growls, and the rhythmic thud of heavy footsteps. "Something's out there," Eric whispered, gripping his flashlight. Suddenly, one of the cameras beeped. A motion sensor had been triggered. Sophie grabbed the monitor, her eyes widening at the grainy image, a towering figure just beyond the tree line, its glowing eyes fixed on the camp. Before they could react, the creature stepped into view. Its massive frame was covered in dark fur, its broad shoulders dwarfing the surrounding trees. "It's him," Eric whispered in awe. But Bigfoot didn't look curious, it looked angry. The chase. Without warning, the creature let out a deafening roar and charged toward the camp. The team scattered, abandoning their equipment as they fled into the woods. "Stay together," Ben shouted, but panic had already set in. Sophie tripped over a root, her camera tumbling from her hands. As she scrambled to her feet, she saw the creature looming over her. Its massive hand reached out, but before it could grab her, a flare lit up the night. Ben stood a few yards away, holding a lit flare and shouting. "Over here," he yelled. The creature turned toward him, growling low and deep, before vanishing into the darkness. The Guardian's warning. By morning, the team regrouped at a makeshift shelter. Ben was furious. "I told you not to provoke it. That thing isn't just some animal, it's the forest's guardian." "Guardian?" Natalie scoffed. Ben sighed, his voice heavy. "The locals believe Bigfoot protects this land. It watches, it warns, and if you don't listen, you don't come back." Eric refused to give up. "We're close to proving it exists. This could be the biggest discovery of the century." Sophie hesitated. "Maybe we've already seen enough." But Eric's determination blinded him. "We'll stay one more night. The forest's rough." That evening, they ventured deeper into the woods, following a trail of broken branches and strange symbols etched into the trees. Sophie noticed something unsettling. The forest had gone silent. No birds, no insects, just an oppressive, eerie stillness. They stumbled upon a clearing filled with bones, animal and human. At the center stood a massive tree with claw marks carved into its bark, radiating like a sunburst. "This is a warning," Ben said, his voice trembling. "We need to leave. Now." But Eric was already setting up his camera. No escape. The ground trembled as the creature emerged from the shadows, more menacing than before. This time, it wasn't alone. Smaller figures, other Bigfoots, perhaps juveniles, appeared, surrounding the team. "We're trapped," Natalie whispered, clutching a stick as if it could protect her. Eric raised his camera, desperate to capture the moment. "We're not leaving without proof." The Guardian roared, its voice shaking the trees. One of the smaller creatures lunged at Eric, swiping the camera from his hands and smashing it against a rock. Ben stepped forward, raising his hands. "We didn't mean to trespass. Let us go, and we'll leave your forest forever." The Guardian hesitated, its glowing eyes narrowing. The final sacrifice. The creature growled and gestured toward the clearing. Ben understood. "It wants an offering," he said. "An offering of what?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. "Blood," Ben said grimly. Before anyone could react, Eric bolted toward the tree, shouting, "You'll get nothing from us." The Guardian roared and charged. Sophie screamed as Eric disappeared beneath its massive claws. The other Bigfoots joined in, their growls echoing through the forest. The survivors. Ben grabbed Sophie and Natalie, pulling them away. "Run," he shouted. They didn't stop until they reached the edge of the forest, the sounds of the Guardian fading behind them. When they finally reached safety, Sophie turned to Ben. "Why did it let us go?" "It got what it wanted," Ben said quietly. Eric's arrogance was the sacrifice. The shadow remains. Months later, Sophie reviewed the footage from her dropped camera. Amid the chaos, there was a single clear shot of the Guardian's face, its glowing eyes staring directly into the lens. She uploaded the image anonymously, warning others to stay away from the forest. But deep down, she knew the truth. Bigfoot wasn't just a legend. It was a warning, and one day, it would come again to protect its domain. The Wendigo's curse. Missing in the snow. The blizzard had raged for days, burying the mountains in an unforgiving layer of snow. When the storm passed, only silence remained, no word from the hunting party that had ventured into the wilderness a week prior. The rescue team was assembled hastily, seasoned tracker Paul, wilderness medic Rachel, and survivalist twins Liam and Owen. They knew the risks, but also the stakes. 5 hunters were missing, and time was running out. As they set out, Paul held up a map, tracing their route. They were last seen near Frostbite Ridge. "That's where we start." Rachel hesitated. "The locals call that place cursed, you know." Owen scoffed. "Cursed or not, we find them and get out." But as they ventured deeper into the wilderness, the cold seemed to take on a life of its own. Signs of desperation. By the second day, the team stumbled upon the hunters' abandoned camp. Snow had buried most of it, but what they uncovered sent chills down their spines. A torn tent flapped in the wind, claw marks etched into the canvas. Nearby, they found scattered supplies and a blooded coat frozen to the ground. "Something attacked them," Paul said grimly. Rachel knelt by the coat, her breath visible in the icy air. "This blood isn't fresh. Whatever happened, it was days ago." Liam picked up a discarded rifle, its barrel bent as if crushed by something inhumanly strong. What could do this? Paul didn't answer. He didn't need to. The first encounter. That night, the team camped near the ridge. The wind howled through the trees, carrying strange, guttural sounds that set their nerves on edge. Around midnight, Rachel shook Paul awake. "Do you hear that?" A low growl echoed from the darkness, followed by the crunch of snow underfoot. Paul grabbed his rifle, motioning for the others to stay quiet. In the faint moonlight, they saw it, a hunched figure moving through the trees, its limbs unnaturally long, its breath steaming in the cold air. "What the hell is that?" Owen whispered, his voice trembling. The figure turned, revealing hollow eyes and a gaunt, twisted face. Its mouth was smeared with blood. "It's not human," Paul said, raising his rifle. "But it used to be." A terrifying discovery. At dawn, they followed the creature's tracks, which led them to a cave partially hidden by snow. Inside, the stench of death was overwhelming. Rachel gagged as she stepped over a pile of gnawed bones. Among them, she found a tattered hunting jacket with the name James stitched into the fabric. "These were the hunters," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Paul examined claw marks on the cave walls. Something drove them to this, or someone. Owen pointed to the back of the cave, where a crude altar made of bones stood. At its center was a blackened heart, still pulsing faintly. "It's a Wendigo," Paul said, stepping back. "One of the hunters gave in to the hunger, and now it's cursed. It won't stop until it's consumed everything. The Wendigo strikes." As they left the cave, the wind picked up, and the temperature plummeted. Snow began to fall, thick and blinding. "It's hunting us now," Paul said, scanning the trees. Before anyone could respond, a blood-curdling screech echoed through the forest. The Wendigo lunged from the shadows, its claws slashing through Owen's arm. He screamed, collapsing into the snow. Liam fired his rifle, the shot echoing like thunder. The creature recoiled, letting out an ear-piercing wail before vanishing into the storm. "We have to keep moving," Paul shouted, dragging Owen to his feet. Rachel wrapped a tourniquet around Owen's arm. "He's losing blood fast. We need to find shelter." The cabin in the snow. By nightfall, they stumbled upon an abandoned cabin, its windows frosted over and its door hanging ajar. Inside, they lit a fire and tended to Owen's wounds. Liam paced nervously, clutching his rifle. "We can't stay here. That thing knows where we are." Paul nodded. "But we can't move until Owen's stable." As they argued, Rachel noticed strange symbols carved into the cabin walls, protection runes, weathered but intact. "This place was meant to keep it out," she said. The wind outside grew louder, and then the growling began, closer this time. The final stand. The Wendigo attacked just before dawn, smashing through the door with a terrifying roar. Its gaunt frame filled the room, its glowing eyes fixed on Owen. Paul fired, hitting the creature in the chest. It staggered but didn't fall. Rachel grabbed a burning log from the fire, swinging it at the Wendigo. The flames licked its flesh, and it shrieked, retreating momentarily. "The heart!" Paul shouted. "We have to destroy the heart." Liam hesitated, then bolted into the storm, clutching a flare. The curse broken. At the cave, Liam found the altar still intact. With trembling hands, he lit the flare and jammed it into the pulsating heart. The heart burst into flames, and a guttural howl echoed across the forest. Back at the cabin, the Wendigo froze mid-attack, its body convulsing before collapsing into ash. Survivors. By the time Liam returned, the storm had passed. The cabin was eerily quiet, save for the crackling of the fire. Paul, Rachel, and Owen sat huddled together, their faces pale but alive. "It's over," Liam said, collapsing onto the floor. But as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the trees, Paul stared into the forest, his expression grim. "For now."